Welcome to Warriors of the World. Today we'll be exploring the Ashigaru, the infantry that transformed feudal Japan. Subscribe now to join our community and support this project. Now, let's begin. In the misty hills and valleys of medieval Japan, a military force emerged that would forever change the course of Japanese history. The Ashigaru, whose name literally means light feet, rose from obscurity to become the backbone of Japanese armies during one of the most turbulent and bloody periods in the archipelago's history. Originally, these warriors were barely worth mentioning in military chronicles. They were simple peasants temporarily recruited to serve as porters, auxiliaries, and at best, cannon fodder to shield noble samurai. For centuries, warfare in Japan had been an aristocratic affair, where samurai, educated from childhood in martial arts, dominated the battlefield with their elaborate armor and refined techniques. The first Ashigaru appeared around the 14th century during the conflicts of the Nambokucho era, when dynastic disputes divided the country. Feudal lords, needing more men for their armies, began arming their peasants during low-activity agricultural seasons. These early peasant soldiers carried rudimentary weapons, often simple reinforced bamboo spears or modified farming tools. What these humble origins didn't foreshadow was how, in just 2 centuries, these common warriors would radically transform Japanese warfare and, with it, the very structure of feudal society. The Ashigaru Revolution is even more remarkable considering Japan's rigid social castes, where an insurmountable chasm separated the warrior nobility from field workers. The turning point in their evolution came with the outbreak of the Unin Wars in 1467, which would mark the beginning of the Sengoku period, the Age of Warring States. The chaos of the next 150 years of continuous civil war would create the perfect conditions for the transformation of Ashigaru from armed peasants to formidable military professionals, forever changing the face of warfare in the land of the rising sun. The transformation of Ashigaru from simple peasants to professional soldiers didn't happen overnight, but was a gradual process driven by military necessity and the ambition of feudal lords known as daimyo. As wars became more frequent and prolonged during the Sengoku period, maintaining temporary soldiers was no longer sufficient. The crucial point was the realization by daimyo that Ashigaru, properly trained and equipped, offered significant advantages. While a samurai required years of expensive training from childhood, an Ashigaru could be prepared for basic combat in a matter of months. Where a noble warrior demanded recognition, prestige, and substantial rewards, a common soldier was content with regular rations, modest pay, and the possibility of plunder. The economics were compelling. For the cost of equipping and maintaining a single elite samurai, a feudal lord could deploy 10 or more Ashigaru. This simple military math led to a revolutionary change in the composition of Japanese armies. If in the early 15th century Ashigaru constituted barely 20% of military forces, by the mid-16th century they represented 80% or more. The daily life of these common soldiers differed radically from the agricultural existence they had known. Initial training focused on discipline and loyalty, followed by endless repetitions of basic formations and weapons handling. They learned to move as cohesive units, maintaining orderly ranks even under the pressure of combat. Ashigaru typically lived in communal barracks within castles or in designated military settlements. This communal existence forged strong bonds between unit companions, creating the cohesion necessary for the battlefield. Their diet, though simple, was more regular and abundant than what they had known as peasants, consisting mainly of rice, pickled vegetables, and occasionally fish or meat. What truly distinguished these new professional soldiers from their temporary predecessors was their identity. They no longer saw themselves as peasants with weapons, but as warriors with a purpose and place in society. This psychological transformation would prove as important as advances in their armament and tactics for the revolutionary role they were about to play in Japanese military history. The equipment of the Ashigaru perfectly reflected their position in Japanese society. Functional, standardized, and without the elaborate ornamentation reserved for samurai. However, what these common soldiers lacked in splendor they compensated for with practical effectiveness on the battlefield. The yari spear became the characteristic weapon of the Ashigaru from the late 15th century. With a length of 12 to 20 feet, these spears consisted of a sharpened steel blade mounted on a sturdy wooden shaft. Unlike the elaborate spears of the samurai, Ashigaru yari featured simpler designs, generally with straight willow leaf-shaped blades that could be mass-produced. The effectiveness of the yari lay in its simplicity and collective use. While a samurai might spend years perfecting complex individual combat techniques, an Ashigaru could master the basic spear movements in weeks. When deployed in tight formations, These spears created an impenetrable forest of steel, even for the most skilled samurai horsemen. The armor of the Ashigaru also prioritized functionality over aesthetics. The most common type was the Okashi Gusoku or loaned armor, so called because it was originally manufactured in large quantities to be distributed to troops before a campaign. It consisted of lacquered iron plates joined with braided cord, providing decent protection without impeding mobility. The Ashigaru helmet, known as jingasa, was generally conical and made from iron or lacquered hardened leather. Unlike the elaborate samurai helmets with their distinctive ornaments, jingasa were uniform, often marked only with the mon or emblem of the clan the soldier served. To complete their equipment, Ashigaru carried a short dagger called tanto for personal defense in close combat. They carried their belongings in a simple cloth bag and carried a bamboo container for rice and a canteen. This standardized equipment allowed for the rapid formation of large cohesive units, anticipating by centuries the modern concept of uniformed infantry. The true turning point in the history of Ashigaru armament would come with the introduction of a revolutionary technology that would level the battlefield like never before: the arquebus. This weapon would transform not just the Ashigaru's equipment but their very role on the Japanese battlefield. The arrival of firearms in Japan in 1543 marks one of the most dramatic turning points in the country's military history. When Portuguese merchants introduced the first arquebus on the island of Tanegashima, no one could foresee how this foreign technology would radically transform Japanese warfare in just one generation. What was truly revolutionary wasn't the weapon itself, but who would wield it. In Europe, firearms were initially resisted by the chivalrous nobility, who considered them ignoble. In Japan, the most visionary daimyo immediately recognized their potential and, crucially, decided to put them in the hands of their Ashigaru, not the samurai. This rotating fire system, anticipating similar tactics in Europe by decades, demonstrates the level of professionalism the Ashigaru had achieved. Executing these complex maneuvers under the stress of combat required intensive training, iron discipline, and effective leadership. The Japanese industry responded with remarkable efficiency to the challenge of firearms. Adapting their traditional skills in metallurgy, Japanese gunsmiths soon produced arquebus of superior quality to their European counterparts. Japanese arquebus were lighter, more resistant to humidity, and were standardized to facilitate repairs and parts exchange, another tactical advantage for Ashigaru armies. The psychological impact of these weapons was as significant as their physical effect. The thunder, smoke, and lethal power of arquebus demoralized enemies, especially those facing this technology for the first time. The samurai, with their elaborate armor and centuries of martial traditions, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to peasants armed with foreign thunder sticks. The true Ashigaru revolution didn't simply lie in their numbers or armament, but in how they fundamentally transformed the tactics and strategies of Japanese warfare. To understand this, we must examine how these common soldiers were organized on the battlefield and how their presence altered the development of conflicts. Unlike the highly individualistic nature of samurai combat, Ashigaru operated as cohesive units under a strict hierarchical system. The basic unit was the kumi, composed of 5 to 10 men led by an experienced kogashira. 10 kumi formed a larger unit called soni of approximately 100 men, commanded by a kashira. This system allowed effective control over large formations in the confusion of the battlefield. Ashigaru spearmen adopted formations inspired by European pike tactics but adapted to Japanese conditions. The Yariwal formation featured multiple rows of spearmen with their weapons extended at different heights, creating a virtually impenetrable front against cavalry charges. On favorable terrain, these formations could withstand assaults from mounted samurai who had traditionally dominated Japanese battlefields. For the arquebusiers, innovative tactics were developed like Oda Nobunaga's mentioned volley fire technique. This formation organized arquebusiers in 3 lines. While the first fired, the second aimed, and the third reloaded. This rotation maintained continuous fire, something revolutionary for the time. Notably, this tactic was developed in Japan years before its European equivalents. The integration of different types of Ashigaru created flexible tactical systems. Spearmen protected arquebusiers from direct assault, while arquebusiers provided ranged firepower. Light units, equipped with bows or shorter weapons, provided reconnaissance, flanking, and pursuit. This combination of weapons under unified command represented a qualitative leap in Japanese military sophistication. Ashigaru commanders developed elaborate communication systems in battle using colored flags, drums, conch shells, and smoke signals. These allowed coordinating complex movements even in the confusion of combat. Standard bearers, carrying the distinctive banners of their unit, not only served as visual reference points to maintain formation but as powerful symbols that strengthened morale. Ashigaru training emphasized collective discipline over individual prowess. Regular drills included practices in maintaining formation under pressure, charge and retreat simulations, and response to various command signals. This methodical approach to training anticipated modern military systems by centuries, representing a radical departure from the samurai tradition centered on individual combat. The Battle of Nagashino, fought in 1575, represents the defining moment in Ashigaru history and a turning point in Japanese warfare. Oda Nobunaga, facing the formidable cavalry forces of the Takeda clan, arranged his 3,000 Ashigaru arquebusiers behind palisades in a carefully selected defensive position near a river. Trusting in his undefeated heavy cavalry, Takeda Katsuyori ordered charge after charge against Nobunaga's positions. What followed demonstrated the revolutionary power of Ashigaru equipped with firearms. Using the volley fire technique, Nobunaga's arquebusiers maintained constant, devastating fire that decimated the samurai horsemen, traditionally Japan's military elite. Chronicles relate that more than 10,000 Takeda warriors fell before this wall of lead, an unthinkable outcome a generation earlier. In the Kyushu campaign of 1587, Toyotomi Hideyoshi demonstrated the effectiveness of Ashigaru in large-scale operations. Leading an army of more than 250,000 men, mostly Ashigaru, Hideyoshi employed massive envelopment tactics. The discipline and logistical capacity of his Ashigaru units allowed him to maintain multiple simultaneous fronts, something impossible with armies composed primarily of individualistic samurai. The Siege of Osaka of 1614–15 showed the final evolution of Ashigaru under the Tokugawa shogunate. In this decisive campaign against Hideyoshi's son, Tokugawa Ieyasu employed specialized Ashigaru engineers to construct elaborate siege works, while his arquebus units maintained constant suppressive fire. The specialization and professionalization of the Ashigaru had reached levels comparable to contemporary European armies. These decisive battles illustrate the fundamental transformation that Ashigaru brought to Japanese warfare. If traditionally battles had been relatively small affairs decided by duels between samurai champions, they now became massive confrontations where collective discipline, logistics, and firepower determined the outcome. Beyond specific battles, the Ashigaru transformed the very scale of conflict. The ability to recruit, train, and deploy tens of thousands of effective soldiers allowed previously impossible military operations. The unification campaigns that finally ended the Sengoku period crucially depended on the ability of the great daimyo to maintain multiple armies in the field simultaneously, something possible only thanks to the Ashigaru. Ironically, the very success of the Ashigaru in these unifying campaigns would lay the foundations for their eventual transformation. With the establishment of the peaceful Edo period under the Tokugawa shogunate, the need for large armies diminished, and with it, the revolutionary role of these common soldiers. Beyond the great battles and strategies, what was daily life really like for an Ashigaru during the turbulent Sengoku period? Historical documents, combined with archaeological discoveries and contemporary artistic representations, allow us to reconstruct a surprisingly detailed picture of these common warriors. For many, service as an Ashigaru represented a significant improvement over peasant life. While a typical farmer subsisted on barely enough rice to survive, facing frequent famines and oppressive taxation, an Ashigaru received regular rations, a modest stipend, and the possibility of social advancement. This reality explains why many joined voluntarily, contradicting the common image of peasants forced into military service. The initial training of an Ashigaru typically lasted between 3 and 6 months, focusing first on basic discipline and absolute obedience. They learned to move in formation, respond instantly to orders, and maintain position even under extreme stress. For arquebusiers, training included meticulous loading procedures, weapon maintenance, and firing techniques, performed repeatedly until they became muscle memory. During campaigns, Ashigaru marched on foot carrying their complete equipment, frequently covering distances of 15 to 20 miles daily. This rapid mobilization capability was crucial for the ambitious campaigns of unifiers like Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu. Units traveled with minimal personal baggage, depending on organized supply lines or, when necessary, living off the land. In garrison, life followed predictable rhythms. The day began with morning exercises and weapons practice, followed by maintenance tasks such as polishing armor, sharpening weapons, and repairing equipment. Ashigaru also performed construction work, from road repairs to castle building. Notably, many of the impressive fortifications of the Sengoku period were built primarily by Ashigaru labor. Entertainment during periods of inactivity included board games like Go and Shogi, storytelling, and improvised weapons skill competitions. Sake flowed freely after victories or during festivals, providing a temporary escape from military discipline. Ashigaru songs, some preserved to this day, reveal a mixture of fatalism, camaraderie, and professional pride that defined their ethos. For Ashigaru, the battlefield offered not just danger but opportunity. The plunder obtained during successful campaigns could transform a soldier's fortune. More significant were the opportunities for recognition for valiant actions. An exceptional Ashigaru could receive promotions, increased stipends, and even, in extraordinary cases, elevation to samurai status, crossing a social barrier normally impenetrable in rigid Japanese society. One of the most fascinating and lesser-known aspects of Ashigaru history is how these common soldiers occasionally achieved the seemingly impossible, rising from their humble origins to the ranks of the samurai elite. These extraordinary trajectories not only represent individual triumphs but illustrate how the Sengoku period, with its constant conflict, temporarily flexibilized Japan's rigid social barriers. The most spectacular example is Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the supreme commoner who came to rule Japan. Born to a peasant family with no distinction whatsoever, Hideyoshi began his military career as Oda Nobunaga's sandal-bearer, essentially a servant in the army. His cunning, loyalty, and extraordinary ability to identify opportunities gradually led him to positions of greater responsibility. After several notable military feats, Hideyoshi received the privilege of using a surname and was eventually adopted into the Toyotomi clan, effectively elevating him to samurai status. Following Nobunaga's assassination in 1582, Hideyoshi emerged victorious in the subsequent power struggle. The former Ashigaru became the de facto ruler of Japan, eventually holding the title of Kampuku or Imperial Regent, the second most powerful position after the emperor himself. Although Hideyoshi's rise is exceptional, it wasn't unique. Hattori Hanzo, the legendary ninja in service to Tokugawa Ieyasu, began his career as an Ashigaru before gaining fame for his skills in espionage and combat. Fukushima Masanori, who began as a spear carrier, distinguished himself at the Battle of Shizugatake and was rewarded with a fief valued at 250,000 koku of rice, instantly making him a daimyo of considerable importance. These extraordinary cases were made possible by the unique circumstances of the Sengoku period. The constant need for effective military leadership created opportunities for talented individuals regardless of their origin. The most pragmatic daimyo recognized that wasting talent due to class prejudices was a luxury they couldn't afford in the ruthless competition for supremacy. The typical path of ascension began with distinguished actions in battle, rewarded with promotions within the Ashigaru hierarchy until reaching positions such as Ashigaru Teisho or infantry commander. With enough achievements and proper patronage, an exceptional individual could receive the right to use a surname and sword, privileges traditionally reserved for the samurai class. Formal adoption into a samurai clan completed this social transformation. What makes these ascensions particularly notable is that they occurred in a society obsessed with lineage purity and the hereditary division between classes. The Japanese social system, codified in the Shurno Ko Sho system, warrior farmer artisan merchant, theoretically did not allow mobility between categories. That individuals like Hideyoshi could rise from the lowest stratum to the pinnacle of power demonstrates how the practical reality of war sometimes triumphed over the most entrenched social conventions. Ironically, once the Tokugawa regime was consolidated and peace restored, these paths of social ascension closed again. The class system rigidified during the Edo period, and the mobility that characterized the turbulent Sengoku period almost completely disappeared. The descendants of those Ashigaru who had achieved samurai status now jealously defended their inherited privileges against new aspirants. The pacification of Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 17th century marked the beginning of a profound transformation for the Ashigaru. Paradoxically, the very success of these soldiers in helping unify the country eliminated the need for large standing armies. During the more than 250 years of the Edo period, the Ashigaru would experience a final evolution that would fundamentally alter their nature. With the end of civil wars, Ashigaru gradually became armed officials rather than combat soldiers. Many were assigned to police duties, watching roads, patrolling cities, and maintaining public order. Others became firefighters, particularly important in Japanese cities built primarily of wood. Some transformed into low-level administrators, leveraging their basic literacy to manage records and collect taxes. The social status of Ashigaru also evolved during this period of peace. They were formally incorporated into the samurai class but occupying the lowest echelon within this structure. They were allowed to use surnames and carry short swords, but generally not the long katana reserved for higher-ranking samurai. They received hereditary stipends, though significantly smaller than those of other samurai. This formal inclusion in the warrior class had contradictory consequences. On one hand, it elevated their legal status and provided economic security. On the other, by becoming part of the privileged system, the former Ashigaru lost their revolutionary character and their connection to the productive classes from which they originally came. During the military reforms of the Bakumatsu period in the mid-19th century, the descendants of the Ashigaru formed the core of the first modern Japanese armies. Their tradition of collective discipline, hierarchical organization, and willingness to adopt new technologies facilitated the transition to Western-style armed forces. The rifle units that replaced Ashigaru arquebusiers employed surprisingly similar tactics, adapted to more advanced weapons. The most enduring legacy of the Ashigaru is found in how they fundamentally transformed the nature of Japanese warfare. Before their emergence, conflicts were relatively limited affairs where aristocratic warriors sought individual glory. The Ashigaru introduced revolutionary concepts: collective discipline over individual prowess, massive firepower over personal skill, and systematic logistics over improvised heroism. Perhaps their deepest impact was demonstrating that effective soldiers could come from any social class, challenging centuries of aristocratic tradition. This lesson would be forgotten during the long Tokugawa peace period, only to be dramatically rediscovered when Japan faced the challenge of modernization in the Meiji era. The ability to effectively mobilize and train common citizens as disciplined soldiers, first demonstrated by the Ashigaru, would become a crucial component of Japan's rapid rise as a modern military power. The story of the Ashigaru represents one of the great ironies of Japanese historical memory. These common soldiers, who fundamentally transformed warfare and decisively contributed to the country's unification, were largely marginalized in traditional historical narratives, only to be rediscovered and sometimes romanticized in the modern era. During the Edo period, official chroniclers, many of them samurai, systematically minimized the contributions of the Ashigaru. Histories emphasized the individual feats of samurai generals, while the disciplined infantry formations that frequently decided the outcome of battles were reduced to marginal notes. This distortion reflected both class prejudices and Tokugawa ideology, which sought to legitimize a rigidly stratified social system. The artistic representation of Ashigaru during this period offers clues about their ambiguous position. In ukiyo-e prints and battle paintings, they frequently appear as anonymous figures in the background, while samurai dominate the foreground. However, these same images, carefully analyzed, reveal the numerical reality. For every heroically depicted samurai, dozens of Ashigaru fill the battlefield. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 brought renewed interest in the Ashigaru. With Japan embarking on rapid military modernization, strategists found in the history of these soldiers a national precedent for mass conscription and professional infantry. The Imperial Japanese Army consciously drew parallels between modern conscripts and the Ashigaru tradition, emphasizing continuity in Japanese military history. In contemporary Japanese popular culture, the Ashigaru have experienced a fascinating rehabilitation. Historical dramas, once almost exclusively focused on samurai heroes, increasingly portray the perspective of common soldiers. Video games like Shogun, Total War, and Nioh feature Ashigaru as crucial military units, educating a new generation about their historical importance. What explains this renewed interest? Perhaps in our more democratic age, the story of common people who changed history resonates more deeply than tales of aristocratic warriors. The Ashigaru narrative offers a counterpoint to the often romanticized samurai tradition, reminding us that Japan's military history, like that of all nations, was built primarily on the sacrifices of ordinary men. Archaeological discoveries continue to enhance our understanding of Ashigaru life. Excavations at Siege of Osaka sites have uncovered mass-produced armor pieces, standardized weapons, and personal items of common soldiers. These material remains help reconstruct the daily reality of these warriors beyond the biases of written sources. The ultimate legacy of the Ashigaru may be how they challenge us to reconsider our understanding of Japanese history. Their rise demonstrates that even in one of history's most rigidly hierarchical societies, circumstances sometimes allowed revolutionary breakthroughs in established social patterns. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is not solely made by elites and that technological and organizational innovations often have more profound impacts than individual heroism. Today, when we look at Japan's self-defense forces with their emphasis on technological excellence, meticulous training, and organizational efficiency, we are seeing the distant heirs of those revolutionary common soldiers who, 5 centuries ago, transformed the nature of Japanese warfare and helped forge a unified nation from warring feudal states. Subscribe now, become a member, turn on notifications, share this video with your friends, and leave a comment so we can compare our knowledge and sources. Thank you for following our channel. Until our next strategic journey, here at Warriors of the World.